A lone dog charged through walls of fire, carrying in its jaws the only piece of evidence that could shatter an empire built on lies. Bullets tore through the night behind it, the roar of engines closing in, but the dog didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. Somewhere in the wreckage, a life was hanging by a thread, and this broken creature, burned, bloodied, and fearless, refused to let that thread be cut. Not tonight, not without a fight. You think you know what loyalty looks like. You haven't seen anything yet. This is the story of a promise stronger than betrayal, of a bond that even death couldn't break. If this moment caught your breath the way it caught ours, stay. Like this video to stand with those who never give up. Subscribe so you can walk every step of this journey with us. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what would you be willing to risk for someone you love? The sun was dying behind the distant hills, bleeding streaks of crimson and gold across the rural horizon. Isaiah Brooks adjusted the faded army cap on his head and continued walking down the cracked sidewalk, the rhythmic click of his boots accompanied by the softer, quicker taps of Shadow's paws beside him. Shadow, a sturdy German shepherd with a patch of white fur above his left eye, walked with purpose, his leash loose in Isaiah's calloused hand. Around them, the town lay in a hush, the kind that only small, forgotten towns could wear like a second skin. Isaiah inhaled deeply, catching the earthy scent of approaching night mixed with the faint aroma of wood smoke curling from distant chimneys. The weight of the years hung heavy on his broad shoulders. At 45, he carried scars that no uniform could cover, wounds stitched not on skin but stitched deep into the chambers of his heart. They had called him home a hero. He had returned feeling anything but. His only real solace came from Shadow, the rescue dog no one else wanted, the one Isaiah had found caged and trembling in a dusty shelter on the outskirts of nowhere. Together they made sense. Two broken soldiers navigating a world that had moved on without them. As they reached the rusted mailbox that marked the turn toward their cabin, Isaiah paused. He knelt beside Shadow and scratched behind the dog's ear, feeling the tremor of silent gratitude ripple through the animal's body. "Almost home, boy," Isaiah murmured, his voice gravelly from years of sand, smoke, and silence. The dog leaned into his touch, and for a moment, the world felt right. A battered motorcycle rumbled past on the main road, breaking the quiet. Isaiah's eyes followed the biker's silhouette until it disappeared around the bend, unease prickling the back of his neck. Strange? Outsiders rarely came this far out. Shaking off the feeling, Isaiah rose and whistled softly. Shadow immediately trotted ahead, leading the way up the gravel path. Their cabin stood isolated among towering pines, its weathered wood blending into the twilight. Smoke puffed from the crooked chimney, and the soft glow of a lantern leaked through the curtained windows, beckoning them into warmth. Inside, the cabin was simple: a battered couch, a scarred coffee table, a fireplace that crackled and spit, throwing dancing shadows across walls lined with yellowed photographs. Most were black and white memories from Isaiah's youth, snapshots of a family he barely remembered. In the center of the mantelpiece, a solitary photo of Isaiah in full combat gear stood framed by a folded American flag. Shadow padded over to the fireplace and curled into a tight ball on the rug. Isaiah hung up his jacket, feeling the chill of the evening settle into his bones. He moved into the small kitchen, poured himself a cup of stale coffee from the pot left on the stove, and stood silently by the window, watching as darkness swallowed the world outside. On the far edge of the property, a faint glimmer caught his eye, a flicker of movement near the tree line. He narrowed his eyes, heart thudding with a forgotten instinct. Probably just a deer, he told himself. Still, he found himself reaching for the pistol tucked behind the doorframe. Old habits die hard. Behind him, Shadow lifted his head, ears perked and body tense. For a minute, the cabin filled with thick, unspoken tension. Then, the night reclaimed its silence. Isaiah let out a slow breath and placed the pistol back. Shadow whined softly but laid his head back down. Isaiah crossed the room, sank heavily onto the couch, and stared into the fire. Flames hissed and crackled, whispering secrets in a language only those who had seen too much could understand. His gaze drifted to Shadow's collar, where the old, battered tag gleamed faintly in the firelight. He leaned over, fingering the worn metal with a bittersweet smile. The words engraved there had always seemed like a joke, a piece of black humor for two survivors. If I live, you live. Isaiah rested his head against the back of the couch, letting the exhaustion of years wash over him. Tomorrow he would chop wood, fix the leak in the roof, maybe take Shadow down to the creek. A small life. Enough. Outside, the first coyotes began to howl, their mournful cries threading through the forest like ancient songs of warning. Shadow stirred uneasily but did not rise. Isaiah drifted toward sleep, his mind finally easing. He didn't notice the distant roar of motorcycle engines growing louder in the distance, like a storm gathering through the woods. He didn't hear the muted clicks of weapons being checked in the cold, predatory dark. But Shadow did, and somewhere deep in the bones of the night, something old and terrible began to stir. The night had deepened into a heavy velvet curtain, dense with the scent of pine sap and the distant whisper of coyotes. When Shadow's sudden growl ripped Isaiah from his uneasy sleep, he jolted upright on the couch, heart hammering, his ears straining against the oppressive stillness that had fallen over the cabin. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and for a moment, Isaiah thought it was just another nightmare clawing at his mind. But then Shadow growled again, low and guttural, his body rigid, pointing straight at the door. Isaiah pushed himself up, muscles aching, and moved to the window, pulling back the thin curtain an inch with his fingertips. What he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. At least 6 figures, silhouettes hunched under heavy jackets and helmets, creeping through the tree line toward the cabin. They moved with a purpose Isaiah knew too well. Like wolves closing in on wounded prey, instinct took over. He reached for the pistol by the door, slid the magazine home with a practiced click, and checked the back window for an escape route. Shadow pressed against his leg. Ready? Waiting. Outside, the motorcycles idled in the dark like mechanical beasts, their growls subdued but menacing. A sharp clink of glass shattering broke the tension like a gunshot. Isaiah barely had time to duck as a bottle, trailing flames, arced through the broken window and smashed against the far wall. Fire exploded outward, licking hungrily at the dry wooden floorboards. The cabin groaned in protest as smoke filled the air, stinging Isaiah's eyes and throat. Coughing, he grabbed Shadow's collar and shoved open the back door, only to stumble back as 2 bikers loomed there, blocking their exit. One swung a crowbar at Isaiah's head. He ducked, the weapon whistling past by inches. Isaiah fired once. Twice, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. One biker dropped, howling, clutching his thigh. The other cursed and retreated. Isaiah seized the moment, dragging Shadow behind him. Around the side of the burning house, the flames roared louder now, devouring the dry timber walls with terrifying speed. Another bottle sailed through the air, bursting into a fresh inferno along the porch. Cutting off the front route, Isaiah sprinted toward the woods, lungs burning, Shadow keeping pace at his side. Just as they reached the first line of trees, a sudden blow slammed into Isaiah's ribs, sending him sprawling into the dirt. His pistol skittered from his grasp, disappearing into the undergrowth. Pain flared white-hot in his side. He rolled over, gasping, to see a biker standing over him. The man's helmet reflected the inferno behind him, an unholy halo of destruction. He raised a heavy boot, aimed straight for Isaiah's head. Shadow lunged, teeth flashing. The biker screamed as the dog clamped onto his forearms. Isaiah scrambled to his feet, grabbing a fallen branch and swung it with all his strength. The biker collapsed, groaning. Shadow released him, muzzle stained with blood. Isaiah scumbled forward, gripping the dog's scruff. The fire now roared high enough to paint the treetops orange. Embers rained down like burning snowflakes. Choking and half-blind, Isaiah and Shadow staggered deeper into the woods. Behind them, the cabin moaned once, twice, then collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of sparks shooting skyward. Isaiah glanced back, chest tightening painfully. His home, everything he had rebuilt with his own hands, was gone. He pressed on, guided by hollow Shadow crouched beside him, panting heavily. Isaiah tried to assess the situation. His ribs were surely cracked, maybe worse. His head throbbed where he had hit the ground, but he was alive, for now. He tore a strip from his shirt, wrapping it around a bleeding gash on his arm. Every movement a fresh agony. But survival was an old dance he knew too well to quit now. Through the haze of pain and smoke, Isaiah caught a glimpse of movement back at the clearing. A group of Bisuls standing around the burning ruins, silhouetted against the One of them pulled a small device from his jacket pocket. And for a moment, the eerie green glow of a security camera playback illuminated the biker's helmet. They were watching the footage from one of the cabin's outdoor cameras. Isaiah's stomach twisted, realization dawning. They hadn't just come to kill him, they had come to erase him, frame whatever remained and buried the truth under fire and ash. He watched as one biker, larger than the rest, pointed toward the woods. "Captain." Isaiah gritted his teeth and forced himself to stand, each breath a knife in his ribs. He turned to Shadow, who met his gaze with unwavering loyalty. "We move," Isaiah rasped, and together they limped deeper into the forest, the night swallowing them whole. High above, a camera lens cracked from the heat, captured its final image. A single biker, slightly hunched, limping heavily away from the flames, his silhouette distorted by heat waves. A ghostly figure caught between life and death, his helmet reflecting nothing but the burning wreckage behind him. The morning broke gray and heavy, a cold mist clinging to the scorched earth where Isaiah's cabin once stood. The smell of wet ashes lingered in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of burned metal and charred wood. Emergency vehicles lined the dirt road, their flashing lights muted in the overcast gloom. Firefighters sifted through the smoking wreckage with solemn efficiency. And, standing apart from them all, was a black SUV bearing the official seal of the county coroner. A man in a dark suit approached a small knot of law enforcement, carrying a polished wooden box wrapped carefully in a flag. His face was expressionless, his movements mechanical, as if he had performed this grim ritual too many times to count. The sheriff, a stocky man with weary eyes, nodded gravely and signed the necessary forms, confirming receipt of the remains. There was no ceremony, no words of comfort, only the quiet scrape of boots against wet gravel, and the soft thud as the box was loaded into the back of a patrol car, destined for Isaiah's next of kin. Shadow watched it all from the tree line, hidden among the skeletal remains of the underbrush, his sides heaving with exhaustion. His coat streaked with soot and blood, he whimpered low in his throat as the patrol car pulled away, carrying the box and everything it symbolized. Instincts warred within him, the need to follow, to protect, to understand. Finally, he turned and melted deeper into the woods, unseen. 3 days later, the Brooks family gathered at the small whitewashed church on the edge of town. The air inside was thick with the scent of lilies and old wood polish. Murmured condolences floated like smoke among the black-clad mourners. Isaiah's sister, a strong-willed woman named Angela, sat stiffly in the front pew, her knuckles white where they gripped the folded flag that had accompanied the box. The box itself sat atop a pedestal draped in black, its surface gleaming under the flickering candlelight. Photographs of Isaiah surrounded it, smiling moments forever in time. No one noticed the low growl that rumbled from beneath the pews until Shadow pushed his way forward, his nails clicking sharply on the worn wooden floor. A ripple of shock went through the congregation. Some gasped, others clutched their hearts. Angela dropped the flag in her lap and stared as the soot-covered German shepherd approached the box with a singular focus. Shadow sniffed the air, hackles rising, then circled the pedestal once, twice, his nose brushing the sides of the box. A deep, anguished howl tore from his throat, questioning the suspeculating, but Shadow ignored them all. He planted himself firmly in front of the box and barked, sharp and urgent, each sound echoing off the high-arched ceiling like a gunshot. Angela rose, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, boy," she whispered brokenly, reaching out a trembling hand, but Shadow backed away from her touch, his eyes never leaving the box. He barked again, then began pawing at the base of the pedestal, scratching and digging as if trying to unearth a hidden truth. The pastor moved forward, hands raised in placation, but Angela stopped him with a gesture. Something deep in her bones told her this was no ordinary grief. Shadow's nose pressed hard against a seam in the box, his body vibrating with urgency. Angela hesitated only a moment longer before making a decision. She stepped forward, her hands clumsy with nerves and charred fragments. Was something else. A collective gasp rose from the room. Inside, nestled among the expected gray ashes and charred fragments, Shadow immediately plunged his muzzle into the ashes, snuffling and pawing frantically. Angela recoiled, a hand over her mouth, as the dog extracted a small, crumpled piece of blackened fabric. threads barely holding it together. Clinging to it was a smear of something dark red, fresh enough to still glisten in the candlelight. Blood, someone whispered hoarsely. Angela's legs buckled, and she sank onto the nearest pew, cradling the flag in her lap as if it could shield her from the nightmare unfolding before her. The sheriff pushed through the crowd. Face pale, he examined the fabric without touching it, his lips pressed into a grim line. "This shouldn't be here," he muttered. Shadow sat back on his haunches, chest heaving, his eyes locked onto the sheriff's face, as if daring him to deny what the dog already knew. Isaiah Brooks was not inside that box, not truly. Something foul had been hidden among the remains, something meant to mislead, to close a door that should have remained open. Outside, the mist had thickened into a steady drizzle, raindrops pattering against the stained glass windows like muted applause. The sheriff straightened, his voice rough with something close to awe. "We need to reopen the investigation." Angela nodded numbly, her mind whirling with questions she couldn't yet form. The mourners began to disperse, eddy and whispering, leaving Angela alone with the box, the flag, and the dog who refused to let the truth be buried. Shadow settled at her feet, his body tense but his eyes calm. He had found what he was meant to find, but he knew, in the marrow of his bones, that the danger was not over. Somewhere out there, Isaiah Brooks was still fighting, still surviving, and Shadow would not rest until he found him. The laboratory buzzed with the low hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whir of machines, the air sharp with the scent of antiseptic and cold metal. Angela sat stiffly on a hard plastic chair in the observation room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Shadow lay at her feet, head resting on his paws, his body deceptively relaxed but his eyes alert on the other side of the glass. Technicians in lab coats worked silently, delicately extracting samples from the blackened scrap of fabric recovered from the urn. Every movement methodical, precise. Angela watched with a mixture of dread and hope clawing at her ribs. The sheriff stood beside her, arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his stubble. They had waited 3 endless days for the DNA results. Days where the world had seemed to hold its breath, where every tick of the clock had stretched into an eternity. The head technician, a wiry woman with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, finally emerged from the lab. She removed her gloves with a snap and approached, a manila folder clutched in one hand. "We ran the sample twice," she began without preamble, her voice crisp and professional. "There is no match to Isaiah Brooks in any of our databases." Angela blinked, her mind scrambling to process the words. "What do you mean?" She whispered. "It's someone else's blood," the technician said, opening the folder and sliding a sheet across the table. Male, mid-30s, extensive criminal record, multiple arrests tied to a known biker gang. She paused, meeting Angela's stunned gaze. "Your brother's blood is not in that urn, Mrs. Brooks, and neither, I believe, is his body." Shadow let out a soft whine, as if understanding the gravity of the revelation. Angela pressed a shaking hand to her mouth, emotions battering her from all sides. Relief that Isaiah might still be alive, rage at whoever had orchestrated this deception, terror at what it could all mean. The sheriff leaned over the file, his brow furrowing. "You're sure about the gang connection?" he asked. The technician nodded, tapping a second sheet clipped beneath the first. A mugshot stared up at them, the man's face twisted into a sneer, tattoos crawling up his neck, a patch stitched onto his leather vest just visible, a skull with crimson wings, the insignia of the Dead Vultures MC, a name that sent a chill down Angela's spine. They had heard the rumors, whispers of drug trafficking, weapons deals, disappearances that never made the news. And now it seemed, those rumors were clawing their way into reality. "We found something else," the technician continued, reaching into a small evidence bag and withdrawing a charred, misshapen object. She placed it gently on the table. It was a metal badge, partially melted but still recognizable. The same skull and wings insignia glinting dully under the fluorescent lights. "Recovered from the ashes along with the fabric," the technician said. "Based on the damage, it was worn at the time of..." Angela's breath caught, a sudden, horrifying image flashing through her mind. A body dragged into the cabin, already bleeding, dressed to mislead, sacrificed to cover a greater crime. Her brother's life traded for silence. But they had underestimated Shadow. and they had underestimated the love that tied Isaiah Brooks to those he left behind. The sheriff straightened, his face grim. Someone staged that fire, planted evidence, tried to close the book on Isaiah. Angela nodded numbly, the pieces clicking into place. But the picture they formed was more monstrous than she could have imagined. Shadow shifted restlessly, sensing the rising storm. The technician gathered the evidence, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "I'll have the full report ready for you by tomorrow. But you need to be careful. If the dead vultures are involved, they won't take kindly to anyone digging into this." Angela met her gaze, steel hardening in her spine. "We're not stopping," she said, her voice low but unwavering. The technician gave a tight nod and disappeared back into the lab, leaving them alone with the truth. Outside, the rain had thickened into a steady downpour, drumming against the windows in a relentless rhythm. The sheriff rubbed a hand over his face, looking 10 years older than he had that morning. "We need to move fast," he said. "If they realize the deception failed, they might come after the family, after anyone who asks questions." Angela rose, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Then we'll be ready," she said, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into her touch, his body thrummed with readiness. Outside, the streets were dark and slick, reflections of neon signs blurring into bleeding rivers of color. Somewhere out there, hidden in the rain and the night, the answers waited, dangerous, buried, and snarling. Angela squared her shoulders and stepped into the storm. Shadow pressed close at her side. Together they would find the truth, no matter what it cost. The rain had not ceased, instead thickening into a relentless wall of water that blurred the edges of the world into shapeless gray. Angela tightened the hood of her jacket against the downpour and glanced down at Shadow, who stood poised at the edge of the cracked sidewalk, nose twitching, muscles coiled tight with urgency. The sheriff stood nearby, his patrol car idling on the curb, casting feeble beams of light into the mist. In his hand, he clutched a plastic evidence bag containing the blood-stained scrap of fabric retrieved from the urn. Shadow whined, low and insistent, then jerked forward, pulling taut against his leash. Angela stumbled after him, heart hammering in her chest. She shot a look at the sheriff, who grimaced but followed without hesitation. Shadow led them into the depths of the decaying neighborhood, past boarded-up windows and graffiti-smeared walls, every step taking them further from the relative safety of the main road and deeper into the heart of the forgotten city. Puddles splashed underfoot, reflecting the sickly glow of flickering streetlights. A rat skittered across their path, vanishing into the shadows. The smell of damp concrete and rotting garbage filled the air, but Shadow remained focused, his nose skimming close to the ground, following a trail only he could sense. Angela tightened her grip on the leash, her breath misting in front of her. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, rising and falling like a mournful ghost. They passed an abandoned playground, the swings creaking mournfully in the wind, and Angela felt a shiver crawl down her spine, as if the very ground beneath her feet recoiled from their presence. Shadow paused briefly at a chain-link fence, sniffed, then squeezed through a gap at the bottom. Angela hesitated, glancing at the sheriff, who merely shrugged and pushed the fence aside. Together they followed the dog into a narrow alley choked with trash bins and broken pallets. The stench here was almost unbearable, a ripe miasma of decay and neglect. But Shadow moved with certainty, weaving through the detritus with purpose. Angela stumbled over a half-buried tire, catching herself against a wall slick with moss. Ahead, Shadow came to a sudden halt, ears pricked forward, body tense. He sniffed intently at a pile of sodden garbage bags stacked against a dumpster. Angela approached cautiously, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the sheriff could hear it. Shadow nosed aside a torn bag, revealing a crumpled mass of black leather beneath. The sheriff stepped forward. Crouching low, he reached out with a gloved hand and carefully peeled the jacket from the refuse. It was heavy with water and grime, but unmistakable. A biker's jacket, the leather thick and scarred, patches stitched haphazardly across the back, the colors faded but still legible. Dead Vultures MC. Angela sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers trembling. "Turn it over," she whispered. The sheriff nodded grimly and flipped the jacket. A hole gaped near the left shoulder, the leather torn and stiffened with dried blood. The sheriff exhaled slowly, his expression dark. "Gunshot," he muttered. "Small caliber, close range." Angela's stomach twisted painfully. Shadow sniffed the jacket again, then sat back looking up at her expectantly, as if to say, "See, I told you." She knelt beside him, hands hovering above the battered garment, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might mean. She couldn't finish the question. The sheriff understood anyway. He nodded toward the patrol car. "We can compare it to his service records. Measurements, scars," he said, his voice rough. "But from the size alone, from the wear patterns." He trailed off, unwilling to say it out loud, unwilling to shatter the fragile hope clinging to the edges of their hearts. Angela closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from the silent presence of Shadow beside her. When she opened them again, she was steady. "Bag it," she said, her voice steady. "We take everything. We check for DNA, fibers, anything." The sheriff nodded and produced another evidence bag, carefully sliding the jacket inside, sealing away the stench and the horror. Angela straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. The rain plastered her hair to her forehead, but she hardly noticed. All she could think about was Isaiah, hurt, alone, maybe still fighting somewhere out there, and the monsters who had tried to erase him. Shadow barked once, sharply, drawing their attention, his nose pressed against something half buried in the mud. Angela hurried over, the sheriff close behind, and together they uncovered a battered cell phone, the screen spider-webbed with cracks, waterlogged but intact enough that it might still yield secrets. Angela wrapped it carefully in a plastic bag, adding it to their growing collection of fragile hope. "He's leaving us breadcrumbs," the sheriff said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Angela nodded, her gaze sweeping the alley, the broken windows, the silent doorways. Somewhere behind one of those doors, she was sure, the next clue waited, and Shadow, patient and relentless, would find it. They returned to the patrol car, wet, filthy but grimly determined. Angela leaned back in the passenger seat, cradling the evidence bags against her chest like a shield. The sheriff showed her his bags openly, eyes half closed but ears alert. The sheriff pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing against the rain-slicked asphalt. The city swallowed them up, the night folding over their heads like a closing hand. The sheriff's office reeked of burnt coffee and damp paper as Angela paced the narrow confines of the evidence room, the low hum of old computers and the occasional squawk of a malfunctioning police radio filling the stale air. Shadow sat near the door, his head on his paws but his eyes tracking her every move. The sheriff hunched over a battered desk, scrolling through hours of traffic camera footage, pulled from the highways and back roads around the fire. Pixelated images flickered across the screen, mostly empty stretches of cracked asphalt shrouded in mist, abandoned intersections flashing green to no one. Angela paused beside him, her arms crossed tight over her chest. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every minute that ticked by without a breakthrough gnawed at her resolve. The sheriff grunted suddenly, leaning closer to the monitor. Angela's heart jumped into her throat. The timestamp blinked steadily in the corner. 2 hours after the fire was first reported, the camera captured a stretch of Old Mill Road, a winding path cutting through the woods not far from where Isaiah's cabin had stood. The road looked deserted, but then a figure emerged from the gloom, staggering at the frames. Angela's breath caught. It was a man, clad in a scorched biker jacket and jeans torn at the knees. A helmet obscured his face, but his movements were unmistakable. He limped heavily, dragging one leg, his free arm clutched tightly against his side as if cradling broken ribs. The sheriff hit pause, the frame freezing on the figure mid-step. Angela leaned closer, her hands braced on the desk. "Can you enhance it?" she whispered. The sheriff nodded, fingers flying over the keyboard. The image zoomed in, sharpening slightly. The jacket was battered, the leather blackened with soot, but on the sleeve, just visible under the grime, was a patch, a military insignia, faded but familiar. Angela's throat tightened. She recognized it instantly. The 101st Airborne, Isaiah's old unit. Her brother had worn that patch like a badge of honor long after his service ended. No biker thug would be sporting it by chance. The sheriff sat back, exhaling slowly. "That's him," he said, voice grim. Angela nodded, unable to trust herself to speak. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for weakness. "Pull everything from that area," she said hoarsely. Traffic lights, gas stations, ATM cameras, anything. The sheriff nodded and set to work. Shadow rose silently and pressed his head against Angela's hip. Grounding her, she dropped a hand to his fur, drawing strength from his steady presence. The minutes dragged by as the sheriff pieced together a rough timeline. Camera by camera, they tracked the figure limping south along the back roads. Always alone, always moving, a ghost slipping through the cracks of the city. Occasionally he stumped, once collapsing to his hands and knees before forcing himself upright again. Every step a battle, every movement a testament to sheer, stubborn will. Angela's heart broke anew, watching him, knowing the pain he must have been in. The terror, the desperation. He's hurt bad, the sheriff muttered, scrubbing a hand over his face. If he didn't get help soon. He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Angela gritted her teeth. He survived the fire, she said, voice shaking with fury and hope. He's still fighting and we're going to find him. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent. As if in agreement, the sheriff pulled up the final clip. This one from a gas station 2 miles south of the last sighting. The footage was clearer here. The man staggered into frame, pausing under the harsh fluorescent lights. The rain plastered his burned jacket to his frame, the helmet still hiding his features. But as he reached up, struggling to unbuckle the chin strap with trembling fingers, the camera caught a glimpse of dark skin beneath the soot of a scar slicing down the side of his neck. Angela gasped, her knees buckling. It was Isaiah, battered, broken, but alive. The helmet slipped from his fingers and rolled out of frame as he collapsed against the side of the building. Too exhausted to move, the screen froze there, on his slumped form a solitary figure fighting against the inevitable. Angela wiped at her eyes roughly. The sheriff looked at her, his expression grim. That was 3 days ago, he said quietly. No credit card use, no hospital check-ins, no cell phone ping since. Angela swallowed hard, forcing herself to think, to strategize. He's injured, hiding, maybe unconscious, she said. Or someone's helping him, someone off the sheriff nodded slowly. We can canvass the area, ask around, but if the vultures are involved. He trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the room. Angela squared her shoulders, feeling the old stubbornness reigniting in her chest. We're not giving up, she said, her voice steel. Shadow growled low, the sound vibrating against her leg. Angela turned back to the screen, staring at the frozen image of her brother, memorizing every detail, every line of pain and defiance etched into his body. Somewhere out there, Isaiah Brooks was still fighting for his life, and now it was her turn to fight for him. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time Angela, Shadow, and the sheriff returned to the precinct. The streets gleamed under the weak light of flickering street lamps, puddles mirroring a sky as cracked and broken as the people walking beneath it. Angela barely felt the cold anymore, her mind consumed with images of Isaiah staggering through the night, wounded but unbroken. Somewhere out there, a message awaited them, a breadcrumb left in the ashes for those brave enough to find it. Shadow padded silently at her side, his ears flicking at every sound, hunched, thin, wrapped in a threadbare hoodie despite the wet chill. The figure glanced around furtively before approaching, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Angela stepped forward, Shadow growling low in his throat. The young man flinched at the sound but kept moving. Stopping just out of reach, he glanced over his shoulder once more, then produced a small USB drive from his pocket, holding it out like a poisoned dagger. You don't know me, he said, voice shaking but urgent. And you never saw. Angela hesitated, then snatched the drive from his hand. The young man took 2 stumbling steps backward, eyes wide with fear. They'll kill me if they find out, he muttered, then turned and bolted into the rain, disappearing into the night before either Angela or the sheriff could call after him. The sheriff cursed under his breath, but didn't pursue. Instead, he turned and ushered Angela inside, locking the door behind them. The drive was small, nondescript, easily overlooked, but it burned in Angela's palm like a live coal. They moved quickly to the nearest computer, Shadow settling under the desk, ears perked and body tense. The sheriff inserted the drive, fingers flying over the keyboard. A single folder appeared, labeled only with the word "True." Angela's heart pounded against her ribs as the sheriff clicked it open. A video file loaded, grainy security footage time-stamped 2 nights before the fire. The image stabilized, revealing a dark garage lit by a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. A group of bikers stood around a table littered with maps, cash, and weapons. Angela leaned closer, squinting at the faces half hidden by shadows and helmets. One figure stood apart from the rest, taller, broader than natural light. He stepped forward into the light, removing his helmet. Angela's breath caught painfully in her throat. It was him, Jason Jax Mallory. A name she hadn't thought of in years. A face she remembered from faded photographs and war stories told around battered mess hall tables. Jax had served with Isaiah in the same unit overseas, had laughed with him, fed with him, survived hell beside him. Now here he was, orchestrating death with the same cold precision he had once used against the enemy. Angela's knees threatened to buckle, but she forced herself to watch. The video had no sound, but the body language was unmistakable. Jax barked orders, pointing to a diagram of Isaiah's cabin, his gestures sharp and violent. The other bikers nodded. One clapped him on the shoulder, another handed him what looked like a crude incendiary device. Angela covered her mouth with her hand, bile rising in her throat. Jax turned back to the group, his face twisted in a sneer of pure contempt. A flash drive in his hand, smaller than a coin, he held it up, waving it like a trophy before stuffing it into his jacket. The meaning was clear. Isaiah had something dangerous, something that Jax would kill to bury. The video ended abruptly. The sheriff sat back heavily, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. Angela stared at the blank screen, her fists clenched so tight her nails dug crescents into her palms. Betrayal burned hotter than any fire, sharper than any blade. "He was supposed to be family," she whispered. The sheriff nodded grimly. "War changes people," he said, "but greed turns them into monsters," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Whatever Isaiah had, whatever Jax wants to destroy, it's the key to everything." The sheriff nodded, already pulling up files. "We'll start with known dead vultures' safe houses, stash spots, any place they could be hiding him or the evidence." Angela laid a hand on Shadow's head, drawing strength from his steady presence. Outside, the rain had intensified again, drumming a relentless rhythm against the windows. A dark song of coming war somewhere out there. Jax Mallory moved through the night, believing he had silenced Isaiah Brooks, believing his secrets were safe buried under ashes and lies. But he had underestimated the bond between a soldier and his family, and he had forgotten that some ghosts refused to stay buried. The night had settled like a heavy shroud over the city, smothering the streets in a damp, suffocating mist. Angela sat in the passenger seat of the sheriff's cruiser, her fingers drumming a restless tattoo against her jeans. Shadow paced the narrow space between the front seats, whining low in his throat, his body vibrating with restless energy. The sheriff drove with grim focus, their destination etched into the tense silence between them, a half-forgotten industrial district on the outskirts of town. A graveyard of rusted warehouses and abandoned factories. The perfect place to hide secrets, to bury the unwanted. Shadow's nose had picked up something back at the precinct, a lingering trace of blood on the jacket recovered from the trash. Too faint for human senses, but sharp and clear to him. He had locked onto it immediately, leading them through the labyrinth of back alleys and crumbling neighborhoods. The cruiser's headlights slicing through the mist, illuminating broken windows and graffiti-scarred walls. Angela shifted forward in her seat as the sheriff slowed, turning onto a potholed access road overgrown with weeds. Ahead, a hulking shape loomed out of the fog. A warehouse, its corrugated metal sides eaten with rust, the heavy sliding doors hanging ajar on twisted tracks. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, his hackles rising. Angela's heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She drew her jacket tighter around herself and nodded at the sheriff, who killed the engine and grabbed his flashlight. They moved quickly but cautiously, Shadow leading the way. The air grew colder as they approached the entrance, a fetid stench wafting from within. A cocktail of mildew, old oil, and something fouler. Angela steeled herself and stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting a narrow swath through the gloom. The warehouse was vast, rows of rusted machinery hulking like sleeping beasts in the dark, the floor littered with debris and puddles of stagnant water. Shadow moved with purpose, weaving between the obstacles, his nose to the ground. Suddenly he stopped, his body rigid. Angela froze, listening. At first there was nothing. only the drip-drip of leaking pipes and the soft creak of settling metal. Then she heard it. A muffled sound, faint but unmistakable. A sob, barely more than a whisper. Shadow darted toward a cluster of crates piled against the far wall. Angela and the sheriff followed, hearts pounding. They found her behind the crates, bound and gagged, her hands tied cruelly behind her back, her face bruised and bloodied, but her eyes clear and burning with defiance. The sheriff cursed under his breath and moved to untie her. Angela kept her weapon trained on the shadows, scanning for any sign of an ambush. But the warehouse remained silent, abandoned. When the woman was finally free, she sagged against the crates. Coughing violently, Angela knelt beside her, offering a bottle of water. The woman took it with trembling hands, drinking in desperate gulps, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Who are you?" Angela asked gently. The woman's gaze darted between them, wary, frightened. But when she saw Shadow sitting calmly by Angela's side, something in her seemed to loosen. "Miriam Mallory," she rasped, her voice raw. Angela's stomach twisted. "Mallory." "The same name as Jack's, yours, mother," Angela said. Not a question. Miriam nodded weakly. "They're planning something," she whispered, clutching Angela's sleeve with surprising strength. They think killing Isaiah will keep it hidden." Angela's breath caught. She leaned closer. "What are they hiding?" she demanded. Miriam's eyes filled with tears. She choked out, "They made a mistake. He stumbled onto something he wasn't meant to see." The sheriff stepped closer, his face grim. "What did he find?" he asked. Miriam shuddered. He's been laundering money through the vultures, drugs, weapons, even human trafficking." She spat the words out like poison. "Isaiah found a ledger. Proof. Real names, real numbers. He wasn't the target, he was just—" Angela sat back on her heels, shock rolling through her, the puzzle pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The fire, the fake remains, the desperate cover-up, all of it because her brother had seen too much, because he had dared to stand in the way of monsters. Shadow whined softly, sensing the turmoil radiating from her. Angela squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, then forced herself upright. "Where would they take him?" she asked, her voice steady despite the maelstrom inside her. Miriam hesitated, fear flashing across her battered face. Then she nodded toward the back of the warehouse. "There's a cabin," she whispered. "Deep in the woods past the old quarry, private property, no one goes there anymore." The sheriff exchanged a grim look with Angela. They both understood the urgency. If Jax realized Miriam was missing, he would accelerate his plans. Isaiah's window was reaching down to help Miriam to her feet. The older woman winced but accepted the support. Shadow circled them once, then trotted to the open door, ears pricked forward. "Ready?" Angela tightened her grip on her weapon, her resolve crystallizing into something cold and unbreakable. "Let's go," she said, her voice low and fierce, and together they plunged back into the night. The forest closed around them as they pushed deeper into the night, the beam of the sheriff's flashlight slicing through the dense underbrush. Angela moved beside him, her heart pounding with a relentless rhythm that matched the wet slap of boots against muddy ground. Shadow ranged ahead, nose low, body taut, following a trail only he could sense. Miriam stumbled between them, weak but determined, clutching the borrowed jacket tight around her bruised frame. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, the faint sounds of the highway fading into nothingness behind them. Somewhere ahead, hidden by the mist and the tangled woods, was the cabin, the place where they had taken Isaiah. Angela's mind churned with fragments of what Miriam had revealed. The ledger, the names, the crimes. Isaiah had never been a target until he became a threat. She pictured him again, staggering along that deserted road, alone, hunted, clutching the key to everything in his bleeding hands. A fallen branch cracked underfoot, snapping her back to the present. They crested a small ridge, and there it was, half hidden by the fog and trees. A squat, weather-beaten cabin slumped against the earth like a wounded animal. One window glowed faintly, casting a pale, sickly light across the clearing. Angela dropped into a crouch, scanning the perimeter. The sheriff mirrored her, weapon drawn. Miriam stayed back, half hidden behind a tree. Shadow growled low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the cabin door. Angela tapped the sheriff's shoulder and pointed. Movement flickered inside the window, a shadow passing across the light. They crept closer, using the trees as cover. At 20 yards, Angela could make out voices, muffled by the walls but heated, angry. She strained to catch words, fragments drifting on the damp air. "Stupid bastard, should have killed him when we had the chance." Another voice, deeper, colder. "If he talks, it's over, all of it. The charity front, the shipments, everything." Angela felt a cold fury settle in her gut, the pieces clicking together in a horrifying mosaic. The dead vultures weren't just a biker gang, they were a facade, a carefully constructed mask for an international drug operation. Their so-called charity rides, the fundraisers, the community events, all of it had been a smokescreen, a way to launder money, move product, build alliances. And Isaiah, by pure accident or cursed fate, had uncovered their secret, had found the ledger that detailed every shipment, every dirty dollar, every name tied to the operation. And for that they had tried to erase him. Angela's hands tightened around the grip of her pistol, her vision narrowing to a single burning point. Isaiah had survived war, survived betrayal, survived the fire they set to consume him, and now she would bring him home, or die trying. The sheriff gestured toward the back of the cabin, silently signaling a flanking maneuver. Angela nodded, sliding her way through the underbrush, shadow glued to her side. The sheriff disappeared into the darkness, circling to the opposite side. As Angela approached the rear window, she risked a glance inside. Her heart stuttered painfully. Isaiah was there, slumped against a wall, hands battered and bloodied but undeniably alive. Two bikers stood over him, one pacing nervously, the other cleaning a pistol with detached precision. Angela's breath hissed through her teeth, her muscles tensing for the fight ahead. Shadow stiffened beside her, growling so low it was almost inaudible. Angela reached down, brushing his head with trembling fingers, a silent command to wait, to be ready. Inside, the pacing biker stopped, turning to the other. "Jack says, end it tonight," he snapped. "No more risks, no more mistakes." The one with the gun nodded, sliding the magazine home with a soft click. Angela's pulse roared in her ears. She moved, fast and silent. Circling to the back door, the sheriff reappeared from the gloom. Meeting her at the threshold, they exchanged a single look, grim and certain, then burst through the door. The world exploded into chaos, shouts, gunfire, the thunderous snarl of Shadow launching himself at the nearest biker. Angela fired, a clean shot that took the second man in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The sheriff tackled the first, wrenching the pistol from his grasp. Shadow pinned the wounded man, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. Angela crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to her knees beside Isaiah, her hands flying to the knots binding his wrists. "Isaiah," she gasped. "It's me, it's Angela, I've got you." Isaiah lifted his head, his eyes dazed but blazing with recognition. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice broken but fierce. "Isaiah." The sheriff secured the bikers with rough efficiency, dragging them into the corner of the room. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick and waiting. Isaiah sagged into Angela's arms, too weak to stand but alive, so very alive. "The ledger," he croaked. "Pocket." Angela fumbled at his jacket, finding a small, battered flash drive tucked into the inner lining. She cradled it in her palm, understanding the weight of it, the power it held. With this, they could burn the dead vultures to the ground, destroy everything Jax had built on the bones of the innocent. Angela met the sheriff's gaze over Isaiah's bowed head, and in that moment, without words, they made a vow. They would end this. They would drag the darkness into the light, no matter what it cost. The first light of dawn bled through the forest, a thin gray line on the horizon as Angela leaned heavily against the battered cruiser, the weight of the night's battle settling into her bones. Isaiah was safe, wounded but breathing, clutching the flash drive that could bring down an empire of lies. Shadow sat beside him, pressed close to his side as if willing the strength to flow back into him. The sheriff moved among the wreckage of the cabin, securing the captured bikers, calling for backup, their radios crackling faintly in the heavy, broken air. It took precious minutes to stabilize Isaiah enough to move him. Precious minutes where every breath he took felt like a small miracle. They bundled him into the back seat, Angela holding his hand the entire way, whispering promises he was too weak to understand. The drive to the hospital blurred into a haze of flashing lights, sirens, and the rhythmic slap of windshield wipers against the storm. The hospital was small, against the edge of town, its faded white walls and chipped signage a testament to years of budget cuts and neglect. But it was safe, and for now that was all that mattered. Nurses swarmed them as they arrived, Isaiah whisked away on a gurney, Shadow barking anxiously as he was forced to wait by the door. Angela paced the sterile corridors, every second stretching into eternity, until finally a doctor approached, his scrubs splattered with blood, his expression tight but not hopeless. "He's stable," he said, his voice a lifeline. Third-degree burns on his side, broken ribs, severe dehydration, minor traumatic brain injury likely causing temporary memory loss. "But he's a fighter, he's holding on." Angela sagged against the wall, relief washing over her so fast it left her dizzy. Shadow whined softly at the doctor, smiled faintly at the dog. Angela choked out a laugh, raw and ragged, then followed the doctor down the hall, Shadow trotting faithfully at her heels. The room was small, the lights dimmed, machines beeping quietly in the background. Isaiah lay motionless in the bed, bandages swathing his torso, IVs snaking into his arms, a nasal cannula feeding him oxygen. He looked impossibly fragile against the stark white sheets, a stark contrast to the indestructible figure she had always known. Angela pulled up a chair beside him, her fingers brushing his uninjured hand. "We're here," she whispered. "You're safe." Shadow sat beside her, his gaze never leaving Isaiah's face. The minutes dragged by, endless, until finally, Isaiah stirred, a low moan escaping his cracked lips. Angela shot upright, heart in her throat. "Isaiah," she breathed, his eyelids fluttered, muscles twitching under his bruised skin. And then, slowly, agonizingly, he opened his eyes, confusion swimming in their depths. His gaze wandered the room, unfocused, then landed on Shadow, and something shifted, recognition sparking like a tiny flame in the darkness. Isaiah's hand twitched, reaching weakly toward the dog. Shadow leaned forward immediately, pressing his head against Isaiah's palm, tore from Isaiah's throat, as his fingers curled into Shadow's fur. His mouth moved, dry and cracked, struggling to form words. Angela leaned closer, tears blurring her vision, and then she heard it, so soft she almost missed it, a whisper from the very edge of consciousness. "If I live, you live," Isaiah mumbled, the familiar phrase slurring from his battered lips. Angela bit down on a sob, clutching his hand tighter. Shadow whimpered, pressing closer. The moment stretched, fragile and luminous. A lifeline spun from memory and love. The machines beeped steadily, a counterpoint to the racing of Angela's heart. She glanced at the doctor hovering in the doorway, who nodded once, a silent reassurance. Isaiah was here, he was fighting, and they had won the first battle. But the war was not yet over. Outside the hospital, the world still churned with secrets and shadows. The dead vultures would not go quietly, not with everything they had built crumbling around them. But Angela no longer felt fear, only a fierce, burning determination. They had tried to erase Isaiah, tried to bury the truth with fire and lies, but they had failed, and now, with the flash drive clutched in her pocket and her brother's life flickering stubbornly back to strength, she would finish what he had started, bring the whole rotten edifice crashing down. She sat back, allowing herself a small, tired smile. Shadow shifted, resting his massive head on her lap. Together, they would see this through. Together, they would make sure no one else ever had to suffer as Isaiah had. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The first true light of dawn poured through the window, golden and new, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Angela allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they would all live to see the morning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Which part of Isaiah's journey hit you the hardest? And where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.